I want to go back to an experience I had in 2017. So I referenced this earlier. I taught in an international law program in Budapest, Hungary, at a Catholic law school, and there were about 19 international law students, maybe 4 Americans, and we were taking up sustainability and law was our topic, and I had the section on the church's teaching on environmental stewardship, and our primary text was Laudato Si. I was so impressed with these law students, but the first thing that I saw, both coming into Prague and then later into Budapest, was the fact that these European cities are absolutely laid out in a much more sustainable way. Mm-hmm. That, and I, in these podcasts, whether it be the EDI topic that we took up recently, or in this, in no way am I meant to be our country's all wrong, and but to really, I think we're invited prophetically to examine our culture through the lens of Catholic teaching, to say, where can we improve, or where can Christians be hopefully in humility, a source of light and goodness. 11, but it just struck me as the plane was going down, you didn't see this suburban sprawl, which really isn't sustainable. As things shift, the COVID and the fact that so much is being done online, which also has an environmental impact. I mean, you can't blink without seeing a truck, delivering some package, Amazon or whatever truck. But maybe talk a little bit about where you think American culture in particular, because Laudato Deum, which just came up from Pope Francis in October, really lays some of this in terms of American culture. And I know that drives some people crazy who are not fans of Pope Francis, including in the American church. But where do you think we can learn from other cultures in terms of, we consume a lot of energy. There's a lot of consumption. There's a lot of waste. Can we learn from other communities that have just simply done a better job in terms of sustainability and how they've set forth their economic life and also their cities and towns?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's certainly a lot more that we can do in terms of investing in public transportation and in reducing, the vehicle miles traveled that people do with the commuting to the suburbs. I'm of two minds. When Pope Francis in these encyclicals talks about sacrifice and how that resonates, I think, with many Christians, because we know from the teachings of Jesus and his example that sacrifice is an act of love, right? Mm-hmm. And so, here we're talking about giving up maybe that, that bigger gas guzzling car, or reducing our consumption and recognizing that the value that we get from life, is probably can come from other places instead of more and more consumption, and which resonates with me as a way to live intentional and value-driven life, and sort of thinking about what resonates in communicating more broadly. And I think some of those messages for people, the general public, maybe some of those don't resonate as well. If you say, well, the solution is you need to deny yourself things, that I think is less likely to move the needle for people than some other messages that resonate more. No one says I want to leave the world a worse place, right, for the next generation. That's very selfish. Everyone recognizes that's, not a way to live with integrity or a good way to be. So I think there are some other messages that have more universal appeal than simply saying deny yourself, consumption. So I hope that we can do things like ban single-use plastics, and then it becomes easy for people, right? You shouldn't, if we rely on that individual choice, of consumers to forego convenience. That's a bit of an uphill battle against human nature. So I think there's ways we can make those changes more systemically.
Yeah, and I think incrementally that people can say, okay, I can do this, this, and this. This is achievable. Rachel, what do you think? Including maybe root causes. What are some of the real root causes of the environmental peril and degradation?
Wow, okay, so
That's a big question.
Those are two very big questions, right? And so I'll just take the first one. I want to emphasize, you were talking about urban planning effectively when you were looking at, what various international cities, how they're laid out versus how our cities are laid out. And, I spent a lot of time in New Haven, Connecticut.
Mm-hmm.
And if you think about the Revolutionary era cities, they actually were pretty well planned.
Right.
And many of the times they had a very substantial green space in the middle of them. And so I find myself wondering, well, why are these cities, why do they look so different? Why do newer cities look so different? And I think a big part of that is the advent of the car, right? So to go back to Joe's point about public transportation, that's something that many international cities have, and our public transportation systems are just not comparable for whatever the reason. But, I think some of the other things that we can learn just have to do with our ways of life and our lifestyles. We were talking earlier about the ponderous nature of the papal encyclical, but then you have to ask yourself, well, why don't I have the time to just sit down and read it? Why don't I have time to inspire myself to think differently about the way I work in the world? And I want to be sensitive because I know for many of the American people, some of whom have to work 2 jobs or, single parents, like time is a commodity, as a very precious commodity, and I think many of us are time poor. We have the things, we have the money, we have the cars, we don't have the time. And why don't we have time?
Right.
And that goes back to your point also about creature comforts. Because we're working to make the money, to get the things, but then we're losing the time. So, and that's like to encapsulate the first question. The second question around what are the roots of why we're here, I think it is this notion of progress. We are just sort of inherently competitive in many ways. Like we all want the next thing, we all want the whatever. But to go back, it's interesting because I was just to refresh myself for this conversation, I went back to the historical roots of our ecological crisis. I don't know if you've read it, but it's an article published in 1967.
Wow.
And in it, it's really worth a read. It's maybe only like 6 or 7 pages. But in that article, Lynn White talks about Christianity as both the promise and the problem. And he actually, and I wrote a couple quotes down, he talks about Francis as the greatest spiritual revolutionary of Western history.
Wow.
So, he first called out St. Francis of Assisi as a revolutionary, as somebody who gave us a new way to think about our relationship to nature. And so I do think, there are some people in our field who might say that the Protestant ethic or this, separation of man and nature or even mind and body is the problem, but I think there's a lot of value in mining that tradition, which is what, Francis is doing now, Pope Francis is doing now. So.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And he does have and again, I'm on record here on this podcast at a Basilica, which is the Pope's church, to say that I do favor robust as the description of Pope Francis's document, and not ponderous.
Yes, not ponderous.
So I'm withdrawing ponderous, but and I agree with you, Rachel. We do ask the question: what do we have time to do? How do we prioritize our time? And the reason he put in so much effort is it's proportionate to the crisis of what we're facing. I loved your comment, Joe, about single-use plastic. I have to confess that that's an area where I need to grow. I'm much better in a number of areas than I was 10, 15, 20 years ago, but it goes back to the convenience, and we have to ask ourselves, can we do away or give up something? In terms of, Rachel, your comment about Francis, St. Francis of Assisi, there's probably no saint in the Christian tradition who's more beloved. He was a revolutionary. I love that description of St. Francis. And he's often described as having the type of relationship with nature that was there before the fall. And so rather than dominate, Augustine talks about this lust to dominate, he's in communion with all of creation in a way that's sublime, and a way that is also educational. As Christians, we can have that relationship with nature, to see its intrinsic value, to see that everything's connected. This is another theme of Laudato Si. Really, the kind of prism through which we're invited to read the document is through the fact that everything is connected, and what he describes as an integrative ecology, one that sees the connection of everything. One area of the document that I found helpful when I was at Our Lady of Lourdes is they wanted to put up a 30-story apartment thing right adjacent to the church, which had been the center of the neighborhood initially. And one of our parishioners talked about, density, density, density. Everything's about density, and he referred to it as dumb density. It was going to overshadow this cultural landmark. And so there was a section that I read from Laudato Si that talks about cultural sustainability. That you sustain these beautiful cultural landmarks, including the one that we have here. One of the reasons why we're going to do a significant restoration of the Basilica Church is because it is a living, breathing church and temple of God's presence, but it's also a cultural landmark. And it's been part of Minneapolis and will be for years to come. I want to go back to that international law program because I asked the question on my final. I asked two questions. One of them was, and I did a critique of American approach to environmental sustainability. I said some nice things as well about my native land, but I asked the question: it was the Trump administration at the time, the decision to pull out of the Paris Accords, was it consistent with a global common good? I had two law students who just blew me away by how fantastically they aced the exam. So I taught for an intense day and then gave them the final.
Oof.
I mean, literally an 8-hour day, and then they had an hour-and-a-half final. A woman from Africa and a woman from Indonesia, I think, got a perfect score, and I almost never give perfect scores on my exams. But one, I don't know if it was one of them, but one kind of left me chuckling because they said not only is it contrary to the global common good, especially given how big the United States is, it will also not make America great again, which was a kind of a pithy response. But I was also struck by the fact that every one of these international law students approached this issue from their own country's culture and history. So one student said, she was from an Eastern country, said, we're dealing with more about corruption in business and in politics, and we can't even get to questions of sustainability. They're not even on the table. A Brazilian student had a rather interesting response from her own culture. And then there were the American students as well. But I do want to go to American culture, because I asked this in an earlier podcast. The church is called to be a reader of the signs of the times, but also to critique with humility what in a particular culture might inhibit social flourishing or collective flourishing. That there can be social sin. We see it with racial injustice. We see it with other persistent and systemic issues of injustice. And I think we've seen it in some places with regard to the lack of care or the lack of awareness to where we are on the environment. What do you think, where can American culture grow and be transformed in response? How do we raise awareness of our fellow citizens and also our fellow Christians and people of goodwill? What can we do without, because if we're moralizing, which neither of you are, how do we come at this in a way that proposes and invites rather than imposes and inhibits?
I'm aware that I'm chatty, so I just want to make
You're
sure
doing great.
I don't step all over your toes, Joe. Well, so Father, this is a great question, and there's a couple things. And you say American culture. I think American. I'm thinking more in terms of American ways of being. One of them is, well, it's two sides of the same coin. One is to recognize other as more than just my doppelganger.
Mm-hmm.
So whether that leads into conversations around race, that leads to conversations around other species. And one of the things, and I'll just give you an example, I think we are capable of seeing suffering in other humans, but we're not capable or paying attention to suffering in nature.
Interesting.
And I say that, so one of the things I focus on in my work is tree health. And the emerald ash borer is a non-native invasive beetle that's come to the United States roughly around 2002 and has almost decimated the entire ash genus.
Wow.
It's a genus of trees, very common in this part of the country, very substantial native significance, cultural significance. It's the Axis Mundi. It's a really cool creation story. But the point is, these insects have largely come over because of international trade. They've been brought over in shipping pallets. And so these insects are impacting these trees, but they don't kill the tree right away. They kill the tree over 2 years. It's like death by 1,000 paper cuts.
Wow.
And so what we're seeing is all you have to do is fly over the Rocky Mountains and see all the standing, dead, dying trees from pine beetles. Like, these insects are killing trees, and all around us is nature suffering, but we're either not able to see it or not looking. And so I guess in my mind, that's the two sides of the same coin, seeing other as more than just me in the mirror, and then also paying attention to what the implications of our actions ultimately are. And I know sometimes that's hard if you're not like a trained forester or a scientist, but we have to be paying attention a little more than we are. And that just goes to, I think, our dwindling connection to people. The pandemic was problematic in many, many ways, but what it did, in addition to, what it did was keep us even more removed from each other. So now the norm is digital communication, as opposed to being in communion, physical communion with each other.
Right. Boy, I think that's well said. Just a couple reactions to that. One is that I think we struggle in American culture with this excessive individualism and not moving beyond. I actually do think we struggle seeing the suffering of others. We're more akin to see it, obviously, than in other parts of nature. But one of the conveners made a note, or one of the speakers at our conference, that he talked about going on a study abroad trip to New Zealand, and he could see the difference in terms of how they approach the land, how they approach nature, how they approach their friends, that there was this beautiful communitarian ethic that extended to the land. And we see it in other places. We see it with Latino communities outside of the United States, beyond that there's a closeness to the land and a oneness. And because of it, more of a inclination to respect your homeland, to respect your environment, the land. It doesn't mean that environmental degradation doesn't happen other places. It certainly does. But there's a closeness, and I think we're invited to kind of, in American life, and it's one of the reasons why I asked the question about, the United States decision, that we can tend to be myopic or tend to be excessively focused on our immediate individual need and not see the good of our neighbor and the good of nature. Joe, any thoughts on that?
Unfortunately, climate has become something that's ideologically polarized,
right?
And so that is a big challenge, and that's one of the things that I was so happy to see Pope Francis make this a prominent issue, is because that has the potential to bridge this partisan divide that we see now, where people say, I don't identify with people who want to fix climate change because they're not like me, and they might say they're not Christian. And so if we can say, no, this is something that speaks to that your Christian faith compels you to pay attention to, and there are solutions that are very consistent with your values, that has the potential to bridge that divide. And that's, so that, I don't know if that directly answers your question, but that's where I go to when I think about the current state of our culture is one of the features is how politically divided we are, and that people, if they're in different ideological camps, that can just make it really hard to find common ground. And this is something we desperately need to find common ground on.
Right, I agree. And then to also say, in some of these areas, the changes, while there will be a cost, effect, a cost in terms of that's called forth, there are financial benefits to some renewable energy initiatives, other initiatives in terms of economically and that benefit the environment. Sadly, though, Joe and Rachel, the polarization also sees itself manifested in the church. So we see that in the Catholic communion, and sadly there are some folks who just write off what Pope Francis says. They see him as a progressive pope, and why is he focused on the environment when there needs to be this, that, and the other thing done in the church? And so one of the, in this conference again that I was at, it was lamented that not more leadership has been demonstrated by the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. This has not been a priority of the conference. And it was certainly of the bishops who were there and the cardinals. And we talked about the need for more leadership in this area. But I agree with you that the more we can find common ground in this area, and I do want to kind of start to wrap up our conversation, which has been really great, and I appreciate your wisdom, both of you. What are things that the average American family can do, steps that can be taken in everyday living that can really curb the impact on the environment and climate change? What are some practical things that we can do?
Sure. We can think about, our transportation, our energy and heating, and our diets. So, we can drive less. We can walk and bike and take public transportation and carpool. We can, if you're purchasing a vehicle, you can get an electric vehicle, and those reduce they have less climate pollution than other vehicles, even considering all the energy that goes into making the battery, and et cetera. We can, we're somewhat, we have energy utilities and they give us energy, but most of the utilities have a little program where you can say, I want to invest, a little more and get my energy from wind or solar, or you can, there's community solar that you can buy into, and then that provides, you're chipping in with other people and making solar panels, and then you're getting energy from that. Or you can put solar panels on your roof, or put geothermal, or put more insulation in your home to make it more energy efficient. And then you can eat, a little bit lower on the food chain, so less meat, in particular the animals that produce methane, which is a powerful greenhouse gas. So beef being the primary. So those are things that we can do to reduce our footprint.
That's great. Does it extend to, I can eat less beef, but I can't, as a Wisconsinite, eat less cheese? But those also come from cows.
I think there is this concept of, like meat eaters and vegetarians and vegans, and there's this other concept called a flexitarian, where you're just, it's in Lent we don't eat meat on Fridays, and so people talk about meatless Mondays. So we don't need this extreme. We need to,
right.
There's degrees, and so we can, it's a. But no, I'm not coming for your cheese curds. They, you can have as many cheese curds as you want, and if you, there's other ways to reduce. So maybe don't have the burger with it, or have the Impossible Burger with it instead.
Okay, great. One of the other things that was moving about this gathering is we had some folks from different Catholic universities, and I remember one of the presenters from the University of Loyola in Chicago, just talking about the work that they're doing there. And I was talking to, he wasn't at the conference, and we are doing Chatham House rules where we're not attributing anything to any person directly. But I ran into the former dean of the law school at a celebration, and he's president. He's just about to retire at St. Mary's University in San Antonio, and he said, is St. Thomas a Laudato Si university? So they actually have, and I said, I don't know, but I'm going to find out. And certainly Loyola of Chicago is, and St. Mary's is, and so they're taking specific steps. And I think the Pope might have even asked Catholic institutions and universities to say, these are the steps that we're taking. And in Loyola of Chicago, they have more green space, their campus, than any other place in the city of Chicago. Chicago was saying that they were going to have the most. It turns out Loyola University does, and they were very intentional about that. But other Catholic universities, and I think Loyola, have meatless Mondays, or they try to conserve and do what they can incrementally in a way that really is impactful in the long run. Rachel, any thoughts on what we could do, and any closing thoughts?
Father Daniel, there will always be thoughts. But we're joking, and Joe's saying he's not going to come for your cheese curds, and he knows pretty well he better not touch my steak. But I think there's something to that, and I'll just compliment what Joe said. He gave a lot of good concrete suggestions, and I'll give maybe a little bit more of a philosophical side to what we can do. Positive action begets positive action. And if we feel good about the choices that we're making, we're going to make more of those choices. So, telling yourself, well, I can never have a steak again, or, I can't possibly, travel or go on vacation, that's never going to get us to the level of change that we need. We need to find joy and not see it as a deprivation of, or a movement from, but a movement toward.
Yeah. That's
And I think there's lots of options out there. Every day you have a choice. And if you falter today, that doesn't mean tomorrow you can't make a better choice. And so I do think building positivity and energy and patience with ourselves.
Yeah.
These are big changes that we have to make, and they're countercultural in some ways. And I think the other thing that I will say is, there's a saying in our field, you can't conserve what you don't know. And I would take that one step further and say you can't conserve what you don't love. And I know it maybe sounds a little woo-woo or corny, but fall in love with nature. Take the time when you're walking. You don't need to know everything there ever was to know about the physiology of a tree, but take note of that tree. Pay attention to what's around you and be thankful for it, because you just never know whether that tree is going to be there tomorrow. So I think it's important to love nature, love your neighbor, because they're linked, and just be kind, be patient with yourself, be patient with others, and let's stop vilifying the them. People make their choices day to day for their own reasons, and let's just support each other in doing better the next time.
Yeah, that's great, and that's a wonderful way to wrap up. I think that, and I appreciate so much the wisdom of both of you. I'll come back to that in 1 second, but I think every day we wake up, we have a choice. We can, and particularly as Christian disciples, we can live in a way that manifests love for God. We can live in a way where we manifest our love for our own person, our own nature, and we can live in a way that manifests our love and respect for the created order and created nature. And as you said, Rachel, to see the connection between love of nature and love of neighbor. That the entire Christian and Jewish faith, Judeo-Christian tradition is founded on love of God and love of neighbor. Justice in the biblical tradition is right relationship with God and neighbor, but also calls us to a right relationship with creation. And then to repair that harm. I do the work in restorative justice. We've got to repair the harm. We've got to name it, which is what Pope Francis was doing. And then he called us to repair it because it's a gift from God, and I think we can invite God into that mix. What I want to end with is just my continuing inspiration of the gifted community we have at Basilica of St. Mary. And it's one thing that, you're both very bright and you're passionate and likable. It's one thing to have those gifts. It's another thing God calls us to use them, to not put them under a bushel basket. So your preparation for this time, your willingness to come in, I see countless examples of that in our parish, and I can tell you a year and a half in as pastor, with the challenges we have. Financially, we've got to restore our church, we've got to grow, we've got to get out beyond our walls to serve and embrace the broader community. But what continuously inspires me time and time again are working and meeting people like you. Because I think God gives us these incredible gifted people who are using their gifts generously to serve the parish, to serve our broader community. So thank you to both of you, and thanks for being part of the conversation. And our BasiliCAST, please join us next time as we continue our conversation on our Catholic tradition, on modern Catholic discipleship.